So hi, this is Mark at Skywagon University. We've got in this very nice 1977 185 and I thought it'd be a good opportunity to totally clarify what a float kit is. And it isn't this. That is not a float kit. That is the floats. So let's have a close look at what a float kit involves on a 185, 180 and a mention of a 206. So people say to me, I've bought a 185, now I want to buy the float kit. And sometimes they've actually bought a plane that doesn't have a float kit on it because they thought the float kit was the floats. The float kit on a 185 and on a post 63 180 is so integral into the plane, it is not economical or feasible to add it afterwards. And I'll show you what I mean. So on a non-float kitted plane, this rivet line here continues straight down to the door hinge. On a float kitted plane, there's this big diamond on here, obviously on it, and then there's this line of rivets here and here. On a float kitted plane, there's a rivet every ½ inch. On a non-float kitted plane, there's a rivet every inch for strength. And talking about strength, let's move further back and look at the ones in the back. More reinforcing skins are these skins, this one, this cross out here, and then mainly this giant patch. It looks like a repair, but that's structural, so that the tail sticking out in midair, because it's no longer on the ground, because it's sticking out on floats, is supported. So this is on both sides, and on the other side I'll show you the baggage door cuts right into this, and then when we're around there we'll talk more about a stretcher door. So that's the structural skins on the side of the plane. So on the left side of the plane, baggage door side, here are the same skins, and here's the big patch, and here's the baggage door cutting into it. So that is a very obvious thing about a float kit. Now a little extra bit of info is if the plane's got a stretcher door, which would be a secondary, it's like almost, it's the extended baggage opens to this seam along here, down here. There's a latch here, there's a latch here, you reach in and the whole side opens. That's called a stretcher door. That was on, you know, not very many planes, but some 180s, some 185s. If there is a stretcher door, that cannot be a float kit. They cannot exist on the same airframe. So if you see a stretcher door, there is no float kit, 100%. That's cut by the stretcher door, so it compromises the structural integrity, so they can't be both. I've actually seen a 185 that had a stretcher door that was ordered new from the factory. Then the customer wanted a float kit, and while it was still being built, they put the float kit patch over the stretcher door and closed it permanently, even though it still had a latch back here, which was strange. Okay, so that's all the patches on here. Now down here, on this lower patch, this is the float attach point. And if you look closely at it, you can see there's 4 holes and there's an impression. That means this plane has been on floats. If it had not been, this is where the rear attach point bolts to the plane with there's a block that screws on here. If this plane had never been on floats, there would be 2 holes with grommets in them and no impression. I'm avoiding the word dent because it's normal to have an impression, because as you tighten the bolts, it squeezes this skin and this skin together inside and it makes this little impression where the block had been. When you put the block on with the 2 holes, you drill the other 2 holes out and put nuts and bolts on and hold them on. So some people will say, I've got a float kitted plane, but it's never been on floats, which is the ideal scenario because you have all the benefits of the float kit, strength, structure, corrosion proofing, but never been near water. So if you look at one and there's 4 holes and an impression, it's been on floats. 2 holes and no impression, it has not been on floats, but it's got all the structural stuff. So the other things which we're going to look at in more detail are corrosion proofing, stainless steel cables, V-brace in the windshield, so let's look at those too. So the other thing on float kitted planes is corrosion proofing. Obviously if they're near water, especially salt water, you need to protect the bare aluminum skins, and that is a zinc chromate that's put on at the factory, and it's through every single surface. It's inside the wings, you can see in this little picture we're superimposing, and it's inside the fuselage, it's up the vertical fin, it's every rib. If you buy like a 182, you'll see zinc chromate in the fuselage, or you'll see it on some ribs in the wing where they were using them randomly out of bins at the factory. But these float kitted planes are zinc chromate throughout the entire airframe. So that's another plus for having a float kitted plane that's never been on floats, because then it's never been near water, but it's also corrosion proofed. And I'm sure that Cessna didn't realize that these things would still be flying 50, 60, 70 years later, so that's a big plus, the corrosion proofing. Sorry, Skywagon. Just got to do it. float-kitted planes also have stainless steel cables. All the control cables for the ailerons, the flaps, rudder, elevator throughout the entire airframe are stainless steel instead of just mild steel wire. For obvious reasons, you don't want it rusting and snapping. So stainless steel cables is another big deal on these. The V-brace. People always see a V-brace in a 180 or 185. A V-brace can go in any plane at any time. You bolt it in and it's in. But float-kitted planes always have a V-brace. And if you bought the plane with factory new, you could have float kit A, float kit B. Float kit A means it's ready to go on floats right now. You can put it immediately on floats. V-brace is installed. Everything is ready to go. If you brought a float kit B plane, it means it has the full float kit, but the V-brace is stowed in the back and you're just going to fly it on wheels. So if you get a B plane and put it on floats, you've made it into a float kit A because now it's on the floats. But anyway, the V-brace is to reinforce the windshield area and stop it, because hard banging repetitive use on rough water will sometimes dislodge your windshield. You imagine how hard it is on the plane. The V-brace reinforces that. It's also good for pulling up your seat, hanging on your headset, but the V-brace is part of the float kit and it should have it in it, as is the center windshield strip. All these windshields are one-piece windshields. People go, I've got a one-piece windshield. All they've done is left out the strip, because what you do is you put the strip on, drill the holes, put it on, mount the compass. So like a 59-182 doesn't need the strip if it's on wheels, so you'll see it with a one-piece. This is a one-piece, but it has that strip and it needs it if it's on floats because it's strength, as is the V-brace. So float-kitted planes have the V-brace in them. So another very important consideration is getting the floats physically under the plane when it weighs, you know, a couple thousand pounds. So let's go up top and have a look. Up here, these rings, they're literally upside down 172 tie-down rings. There's 4 of them. There's a bracket that you dangle from a pulley and a hanger and a beam like that. And it comes down and grips all 4 of them and lifts the entire plane off the ground. Hence the name, lifting rings. So the plane's dangling in midair, you remove the gear and the floats get rolled underneath, you lower the plane down. So float-kitted planes must have lifting rings. And since we're up here, gas caps. You might think it's not a big deal, but a float-kitted plane, okay, we're going to get technical here. A float-kitted bladdered 185, 180 has 4 gas caps, 2 on each wing. There's not 2 tanks here, this is 1 tank with 2 caps. If this was a standard fuel, like this is an 84-gallon plane with bladders, it's a 77, wet wings start in 79. So if this is a long-range bladdered float-kitted plane. If it had no float kit and it was long-range fuel, it would only have the outboards, and you would have a cover here for getting the bladder in the hole and maneuvering it around, but no cap. If this was a non-float-kitted 65-gallon range, standard range fuel plane, it would have only inboard caps. So in a nutshell, only inboard 65 gallons, only outboard 84 gallons, 78 usable. Both of them float-kitted. Now if this was a 79 or 80, half of 80, 185, remember they built them from 61 to 1985, so 1979 gets a wet wing, which is an 88-gallon wet wing, 90 if it's level in a 182. It would have inboard only, so there'd be 1 cap here, no access panel because it's a wet wing. So if you look at it, you go, oh, 65 gallons. It could be long-range wet wing. There's no such thing as standard range wet wing. So if there's an inboard cap on a 79 or 80, it is a wet wing, long-range fuel, float kit or not. So that's something that traps people. Then, in 1981, at the request of the marketplace, noticing some of the wet wings were seeping due to flexing of the wing on rough water float landings, Cessna put bladders back in them. So you had wet wing 79, wet wing 80, most of it, and 81 to 85, 185s, have bladders put back in, and Cessna charged $900 extra to put the bladder in. And everyone's like, hang on a minute, 1977, they were free, because yeah, modern times. So bladders are in 80, half of 80, through to 1985, 185s with float kits. 81 to 85, 185s without float kits are always wet wing with 1 inboard cap. Confusing. But don't go just by model year changes and float kits by just the position of the caps. You've got to look at the whole picture. Okay, let's climb down from this. So 185s with float kits also have got they call it the 403 engine mount because it came with the 403 prop, but it's a heavier duty engine mount for float kitted planes. And the way to tell, normally an engine mount only has this tube, like in a 182, and it bolts through to the firewall. The float kitted heavy engine mount has a vertical tube here and a horizontal one going across the back. So if you removed it, there'd be a vertical, horizontal, and a vertical, like three sides of a square. So that's the heavy-duty float plane engine mount. And if you get the upgraded version of it as aftermarket, like you put a 550 in the plane, or you want, you know, bigger, better, nastier, you can buy the Casola engine mount, which is an aftermarket one, which does exactly the same job. So that is a float-kitted engine mount. Float plane exhaust. You'd think it's weird, but a normal exhaust just sticks out. The float plane exhaust has got this little kink in it, and you think, what would that do? Well, the propeller is turning, the wind is blowing a corkscrew of air around the fuselage as the plane hurtles through the air, and the exhaust, if it were just sticking out the way it would be with a non-float kitted plane, will circle right around and go in the gear leg, where the gear leg goes through the fuselage. There's a rubber seal, but a lot of them, they're deteriorated and there's a gap there. And if you get the exhaust gases going in there and mixing with water from the float plane operations and the spray and the mist, you get a combination of chemicals which end up being sulfuric acid or similar, and it will eat away at your inner structure of your gearbox. So they bend the exhaust down a bit so the corkscrew spiral goes under the middle of the plane rather than into the gear leg hole. That's a gem of information that Joe Stansel taught me years ago that not a lot of people know. And then just for the hell of it, since we're here, this cutout has been done after the fact, and that's where a ski tab would bolt. That's not a factory cutout. And also this louver, it's a cowling cooling louver. It's on 182s, 206s. 185s didn't have that either. But if you add it, it means that on floats you can fly with the cowl flaps closed and let the cooling come through the side of the cowl. But that's just a tidbit of information because we were in this area. But that's the float plane exhaust. So not float kit, but just interesting. The rear attach points are back there. The forward attach point for the floats is the gear leg. So if it's dangling from the ceiling and you remove the big bolt inside and the inner support shell, take this gear leg right out. This weighs, this heavy steel, 3/4 inch. The front attach point for the floats is like a stunted gear leg that goes in, bolts to the same bolt inside the plane that the gear leg bolts into, but it comes out and ends in a point like this with a hole in it. And that is where the float attach point comes up and grips it. That isn't float kit, and it's on all of them, but that is how they attach. Rear, front, both sides. So here we are at the tail. This is on 3-window 180s and 185s, all 185s. The water rudder centering springs, this cluster of rivets here, that seem to be doing nothing on the outside skin of the plane, have got the brackets inside the plane hanging down so that the water rudder centering springs can be mounted. So if this were non-float kitted, there would be this rivet line, and this matrix of them here would not be on it. That's another little giveaway. All 185s have got this big dorsal fin, not this, not the vertical fin, the dorsal part, this. So they start, a 180 and a 185, they start in the same place up there, and they taper up at different rates. Like on a 180, the dorsal fin comes up to here and then starts up the vertical fin. A float kitted, a 185, they put on a bigger dorsal, so instead of 8 inches, it's 18 inches. They put a bigger one on because they thought 300 horsepower, IO 520 torque, P-factor on floats or whatever would give it a much more lateral twist, so they put a bigger dorsal to give it ventral stability. And so all of them have that. Now 180s, they have the short one, but float kitted 180s, 1975 and newer, which would be 1975 and 1981 inclusive, if they have a float kit, they have this fin. So all 180s have fins to here, float kitted 75 and newers have the fin to here. And that's called, cunningly, the big fin. So if you've got a 75 to 81 180, with a big fin on it, it's eligible for a thing called the Kenmore Gross Weight Increase STC. So for the $500-600, you get a postcard size bit of aluminum about that big that rivets onto the face of the spar underneath here to strengthen it, and that gives you 290 pounds more useful load. It's called the Kenmore Gross Weight Increase STC. You can only do it to the big finned 180s from 75 to 81. And the reason they missed out accidentally on not doing all of them is because Kenmore at the time had 3 late model 180Ks on floats with low useful load. So they thought, what can we do about this? Let's get an STC, put it on. Everybody went, hey, we want that. So they did it. But accidentally, because they were 180s on floats, they had big fins, and in having big fins, it was only eligible to that. So if they'd done it for the 180s with the small fins, they would have a much larger market, 4,000 more planes. Well, 4,000 planes in total. If you put this big fin on a pre-75 180, you can have the Kenmore Gross Weight Increase STC and get 290 more pounds useful load. But this fin is $8,000. So float kitted 180, it's $500 for the kit. Then you've got to put it on. But for a non-float kitted 180, it's $8,000 more for the dorsal fin as well. So to recap that whole thing in a couple of words is float kitted 180s from 75 and newer have the big fin on them. And since we're talking about tails, 206s with float kits, obviously sloped tail. If 80% of 180s and 185s have float kits. 10% of 206s have float kits. And a 206 with a float kit has a taller vertical fin with a much larger counterweight, and the rudder, which would be roughly this wide but sloped, sticks out 6 more inches. They have a longer tail cone. To see how all 3 surfaces end in the same place, roughly here, a 206, 8 more inches, larger rudder, and that rudder alone for a 206 is about $10,000 used if you can find one. So a 206 is a much more difficult plane to find with a float kit than a 180 or 185. So this was just a quick video to, I've done a float kit video before, but I wanted to get this is a nice 185, and I just thought let's do exactly what a float kit is to dispel the myth of it being the float. So this is Mark at Skywagon University. We do a lot of videos like this. A lot more of them are like model year changes and flying. This particular plane, we're going to do a video on what years 61 to 85 185s went through their changes. So we'll use this plane as an example on a future video. But in the meantime, if you like these, subscribe on the little link, click on the bell for notifications, and we're trying to get our subscriptions up to 100,000 as soon as we can. So please subscribe and refer me to anybody you think would be interested and have them subscribe too. So thanks very much for watching.